The clock struck 6 p.m. The Golden Plate, the most exclusive restaurant in town, buzzed with its usual hum of quiet conversation and the clinking of fine crystal glasses. Waitstaff glided between tables, their movements flawless, their faces trained into polite masks. But it wasn't just the luxury that set the Golden Plate apart. It was its unwavering adherence to rules, every detail polished to perfection. For the staff, the code was simple. No one guest was to receive special treatment, not even if they were someone you recognized on the street or in the news. Tasha Johnson, however, wasn't the type to follow rules simply because they were rules. At 25, she had been working at the Golden Plate for over a year, and although she loved the work, she never fully embraced the cold perfection the restaurant demanded. She believed in people, their stories, their struggles, their joy, and that meant she couldn't simply deliver food and take orders without thinking about the people she was serving. If someone needed a little extra attention, Tasha gave it. A smile, a kind word, a quick check to see if someone was enjoying their meal. It wasn't that she went out of her way to stand out. In fact, it was the opposite. Tasha simply saw the good in everyone around her, believing that even the smallest acts of kindness could change someone's day. To her, service wasn't just a job, it was a way of connecting with others, even if just for a moment. But tonight was different. As she carried a glass of wine to the back of the restaurant, a shadow passed over the door. She barely glanced up, just another customer entering. But then she noticed it. His face was all too familiar, but what struck her was the quiet heaviness in his step. The sharp-cut suit, the polished shoes, they were all perfect. But it wasn't the look of someone who walked through life untouched. This man had something on his mind. Donald Trump. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the high-profile guest. It was the way he looked. Troubled. Distracted. She hesitated, the wine glass in her hand steady, her mind racing. Should she approach him? Her job, her instincts told her to stay in line, keep the service clean, keep it simple. But she couldn't ignore the pull to do something more. Something real. Tasha took a breath, and with a quiet resolve, she walked over to his table. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice warm and inviting, her smile soft but genuine. "Is there anything I can get you? Something to make your meal more enjoyable." He looked up at her, surprised for a moment, as if he had forgotten where he was, who he was, or maybe both. His gaze softened as he met her eyes, and for a split second, Tasha saw it. The weight of his worries. The burden he carried. "Just water," he replied quietly, his voice low but thick with something more. Something unsaid. Tasha nodded, and without asking further questions, she returned to the bar. But as she poured the water into a clean glass, she couldn't shake the feeling that this small interaction, this simple act of kindness, had changed something. Something invisible. Something that could unravel a thread she hadn't even seen. The evening continued like any other, with soft music playing in the background and the chatter of the guests filling the air. Tasha went about her duties, checking on tables, delivering food, and making sure everyone had everything they needed. But the moment she had shared with Donald Trump lingered in her mind. It wasn't that she expected anything in return. It was simply a moment of human connection, the kind she believed was worth more than any tip. But that belief would soon be tested. As the clock inched toward 8 p.m., the flow of customers started to dwindle. The night was winding down, and the kitchen was preparing to close. Tasha finished cleaning a table when Marcus Reed, the restaurant's manager, appeared at her side, his face tight with disapproval. "Tasha," he said, his voice clipped and formal. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Her heart skipped. Marcus rarely took the time to address her directly. She had always followed the rules and done her work with efficiency, just like everyone else. He wasn't known for doling out praise, but neither did he often reprimand her. But tonight, his gaze felt different, colder. "Of course," she replied, trying to read his expression as she followed him to the back office. Once the door clicked shut behind them, Marcus turned to face her. His gaze hardened, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "I noticed you spent extra time with a certain guest tonight," he said, his tone stern. Donald Trump, of all people. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She tried to explain, her voice steady. I was just making sure he had everything he needed." He seemed troubled. I thought a small gesture of kindness might help. Marcus shook his head, his brow furrowed. "You're a waitress, Tasha, not a therapist. The rules are clear. Every guest must be treated the same. We don't give preferential treatment, not even for someone like him. You know that." Tasha opened her mouth to defend herself, but Marcus cut her off before she could speak. "This restaurant runs on order," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "It's not about you or your personal feelings. It's about consistency. You've disrupted that tonight. I'm afraid I'll have to let you go." Tasha's stomach dropped. The words felt like a slap, but she held her ground, trying to keep her voice calm. "But it was just a moment of kindness. I didn't." "Enough." Marcus snapped, his eyes cold. "This isn't up for discussion. You can go now." The world seemed to shift under her feet as she stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. All her hard work, her dedication to her job, had amounted to this. For one simple act of kindness, she was being punished. Without another word, Tasha turned and walked out of the office, her mind in a haze. The restaurant that had once felt like home now felt foreign, a place that valued rules over the human touch. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Tasha could feel the weight of her decision to show compassion settle heavily on her shoulders. It didn't seem fair. The anger rose in her chest. And yet, in the midst of it all, a quiet resolve began to grow. She would not let this be the end. She would not let the price of kindness be her defeat. Tasha walked through the quiet streets, her footsteps echoing against the pavement. The night seemed colder than it had moments before, and she wrapped her coat tighter around her, but no amount of warmth could shake the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The city around her moved on, but she was frozen, stuck in a moment she didn't understand. Why had her small act of kindness, something so simple, led to her dismissal? She could still feel the sting of Marcus's words. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about the guest. It was about the rules. The unyielding, cold, hard rules that had stripped away any trace of humanity in the service she provided. But even in the midst of her confusion, a quiet anger began to build inside her. "This isn't fair," she thought. "I can't let it go like this." Tasha's thoughts kept circling back to Marcus's face. His cold detachment. His belief that every customer should be treated the same, no matter what. But in a place like Golden Plate, where every dish was perfect and every guest was served with precision, wasn't there something to be said for a human touch? Wasn't there room for kindness in a world so often ruled by rules? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from Linda Carter, her longtime friend, and someone who always had a fair sense of justice. Linda was a community advocate, someone who fought for what was right even when it seemed hopeless. Tasha had always admired her spirit, and right now, she needed that spirit more than ever. They agreed to meet the next morning in a small park on the edge of the city. As Tasha walked through the early morning mist, the sun barely visible over the horizon, she tried to shake off the feeling of defeat. The community she lived in, her friends, the people she served, the people who saw her as someone who cared, were all counting on her to make this right. When she met Linda, she felt a weight lift. Linda's presence was a calm balm on her frayed nerves. Linda listened patiently as Tasha poured out her story, explaining everything that had happened, from the moment she saw Trump's troubled face to Marcus's cold decision to fire her. She didn't leave anything out. Linda didn't interrupt. She simply listened. When Tasha was done, Linda's face was thoughtful, but her resolve was clear. "Tasha, what they did isn't just wrong, it's a mistake. For you, for them, for the community," Linda said, her voice steady with conviction. "But we can fix this. We can make sure people know what really happened and why what you did matters. You just need to trust that your kindness isn't something to apologize for." Tasha nodded, her heart feeling lighter for the first time since her firing. She wasn't alone. She had Linda by her side, and together they would make this right. The following days were a blur of activity. Tasha and Linda worked tirelessly, gathering testimonies from former employees and regular patrons of Golden Plate. They spoke with people who had witnessed Tasha's kindness, People who saw the value in the small, everyday moments of compassion that had been the heart of the restaurant service. As word spread about Tasha's firing, something started to shift. Conversations began in local cafes, on street corners, and in community centers. The people who knew Tasha, the ones who had seen the impact of her kindness, rallied behind her. Her story wasn't just one of a waitress being unjustly fired. It became a story of a community's values being called into question. At first, the backlash was quiet, small murmurs in the corners of the city. But soon, it became louder. Linda had contacts at local blogs and news outlets, and within days, Tasha's story was being shared. Articles began to surface, and social media posts exploded with support. Tasha had no idea how quickly things were changing. She sat in Linda's living room one evening, her mind spinning as they went over their next steps. "I never expected this. All I wanted was for people to see that kindness matters," Tasha said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I know," Linda replied, her voice calm but filled with determination. "But sometimes, Tasha, it takes a spark to ignite a fire. Your story is that spark." Tasha looked out the window, the streetlights casting long shadows across the city. She felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something much bigger, a chance to change how service workers were treated, to show that kindness had a place in the workplace. The public support was overwhelming. Former employees of Golden Plate reached out, sharing their own stories of being reprimanded for something as simple as giving a guest an extra moment of attention. It became clear that Tasha's experience was not unique. It was a symptom of a much larger problem in the industry. People had become so consumed with rules, with consistency, that they had forgotten the human side of service. One evening, Tasha and Linda attended a public meeting where the growing outrage was palpable. People who had never met Tasha before spoke out, passionately defending her and the values she represented. Workers from all over the city shared their own stories, echoing the same sentiment. Rules that ignored empathy were broken. Tasha stood in the back of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. It was overwhelming. People were finally listening. And then, a surprising voice joined the conversation. Donald Trump. He had been following the story from his office, listening to the growing momentum of the public outcry. He had heard about Tasha's firing and the unfair treatment she had received. That small, brief moment of kindness she had shown him had stayed with him. He remembered how it had felt to be treated like a person, not just a guest. Trump's appearance at the public meeting stunned everyone. The room fell silent as he stepped up to the microphone, his usual bravado tempered by a rare humility. "I've been following this," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "What happened to Tasha Johnson is wrong. She did what any decent person would do. She showed compassion. And for that, she was punished. That's not right." Tasha's heart raced. She had never expected him to speak out in her favor, let alone take the stage. "I don't care who you are, or how much money you have, or how famous you think you are," Trump continued. "What matters is how you treat people. The rules are important, yes. But at the end of the day, it's people who make the business, not the rules." The crowd erupted into applause. Tasha, standing at the back of the room, felt tears well up in her eyes. The support she had never imagined was real. The fight for kindness was no longer just her own. It was the community's, it was everyone's. Trump's speech was only the beginning. The very next day, he announced the creation of a new initiative, a foundation dedicated to supporting service workers who faced unfair treatment. The foundation's goal was clear: to ensure that kindness, compassion, and fairness were valued as much as rules and policies in the workplace. Tasha, still reeling from the turn of events, found herself receiving messages of support from across the city. People from all walks of life reached out, offering their encouragement and even job opportunities. The movement, sparked by her firing, had started something bigger, something that would change the way service workers were treated, not just in the Golden Plate, but everywhere. In the weeks that followed, the transformation was palpable. What had started as an injustice against one woman had blossomed into a widespread movement for fairness and empathy in the workplace. Tasha's story had sparked something deep within the community, something people had long ignored. Kindness, when given without expectation, had the power to change the course of events. The foundation that Trump had launched began working closely with businesses, encouraging them to rethink their policies. It wasn't about throwing out the rules completely, but about finding a balance. Trump's initiative wasn't a grand gesture for show. It was a step toward real change, one that would ensure no worker would ever be punished for simply showing compassion. Tasha, still processing the whirlwind of events, was offered a chance to speak at a local conference about her experience. The invitation came unexpectedly, and at first, she was hesitant. She wasn't used to the spotlight. She wasn't a public speaker. But Linda, ever the voice of reason, encouraged her. "You've lived this, Tasha. Your voice matters. People need to hear you," Linda urged. Tasha agreed, and the day of the conference, as she stood before the crowd, she felt the weight of her story. But this time, it wasn't a burden. It was a testament to the strength that kindness could bring. Her words were simple, but they resonated deeply. She talked about how it felt to be fired for offering someone a little extra attention, a simple gesture she thought was just part of being a good person. She spoke about how, in that moment, she had felt both isolated and misunderstood. But more than anything, she spoke about the power of change, of how one small act, one moment of kindness, could begin to shift an entire community's mindset. As she finished, the room erupted in applause. And for the first time since everything had happened, Tasha felt that the storm was over. Not only had she weathered it, but she had come out stronger, more determined, and ready for what came next. Meanwhile, Golden Plate, which had been under fire for its rigid policies, began to feel the pressure of public opinion. In a surprising turn of events, Mr. Alan Barnes, the owner of Golden Plate, called a public forum to address the growing backlash. He admitted that the restaurant's strict adherence to rules had led them to overlook the human aspect of service, and he promised that changes would be made. "We've learned a hard lesson," he said during the forum. "The human touch is just as important as the rules that govern us. It's clear that kindness cannot be ignored. We will be reevaluating our practices, and we owe Tasha Johnson an apology." Though it was a start, Tasha chose not to return to Golden Plate. She had moved on, embraced new opportunities, and found a place where her values could be recognized. A place where kindness would never again be viewed as a weakness. But more than that, Tasha's story had become a beacon for change. In every corner of the city, people began to rethink how they treated one another. Workers, customers, and managers alike were starting to realize that empathy and fairness should guide their decisions, not just rules and policies. As months passed, the ripple effects of Tasha's firing and the subsequent movement grew stronger. What had started as a single, quiet injustice was now the focal point of a citywide conversation. Businesses began to reconsider their policies, realizing that they could create a culture of empathy without sacrificing professionalism or standards. Local restaurants, including some of the Golden Plate's competitors, began to adopt new measures. Managers were trained to value both consistency and compassion. Service workers, who had often been overlooked or punished for their kindness, now found themselves in workplaces where empathy was not just appreciated, it was expected. Tasha became a symbol of courage. She was invited to community events, panel discussions, and conferences where she shared her journey. Her message was clear: kindness was not a weakness. It was a strength that needed to be recognized and celebrated. But it wasn't just the businesses that changed, it was the people. Tasha's story resonated with those who had been silently suffering in the background, afraid to speak out. Service workers who had been conditioned to smile and nod through their pain began to ask for more, not just for better treatment, but for the respect they deserved. Donald Trump's foundation continued to grow, gathering support from other prominent business leaders who were eager to make a difference. The foundation provided scholarships for aspiring hospitality workers, offered mentorship programs, and most importantly, advocated for policies that protected workers' rights to show kindness without fear of punishment. The public began to shift their views as well. At first, many had been skeptical of Trump's involvement. But as the foundation's work gained momentum, people started to see the tangible changes. Businesses that had once been cold and indifferent began to warm. And the idea that a service worker's heart mattered more than their ability to follow a strict set of rules took hold. The tipping point came when a local restaurant, a former competitor of Golden Plate, made a bold decision. The restaurant's owner, inspired by Tasha's story and the success of Trump's initiative, announced a complete overhaul of their policies. No longer would their employees be reprimanded for kindness. The new policy would reward employees who went above and beyond, offering personalized service and genuine care for customers. The news spread quickly, and soon after, other establishments followed suit. The city was slowly becoming a place where kindness was at the forefront of every business interaction, where compassion was just as important as any set of rules. Tasha, now a beloved figure in her community, had finally found peace. She had turned a painful chapter in her life into something bigger, a movement that changed the way service workers were viewed. But she wasn't done. Tasha continued to advocate for workers' rights, using her platform to ensure that the changes made in her city would spread far and wide. One afternoon, as Tasha walked through the city square, she was stopped by a group of young service workers. They recognized her instantly. "We heard your story," one of them said, his voice filled with admiration. "Thank you. You made things better for all of us." Tasha smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "We all made this change, and it's just the beginning." And as she continued on her walk, Tasha couldn't help but think back to that first moment when she had shown compassion to a troubled guest. What had felt like a small, simple gesture had sparked a movement. It had led to something bigger than herself, a world where kindness was celebrated, where fairness prevailed, and where every voice was heard. Tasha's journey wasn't just a story of one woman fighting for what was right. It was the story of a community that stood up together to make sure that the human touch would never again be overshadowed by rules.